Okay, today I'm returning again to Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and The Angel Out Ahead. And I finally got into sort of the third section in his chapter 7, which is about apophatic theology and his sort of um, Persian Sufist response to modern nihilism. And I'm not going to do any introduction today, so I would really recommend going back to a couple of episodes ago. I think it was like 2021 that said we become capable of God is probably the best one, or the one with sunflowers. I forget. Out inside turn the world. I think I called that. Anyway, both of them are going to be much, I don't know, clearer presentations of what my take on all this stuff is and part of its relevance. But here I'm moving on into the next section in Cheetham and Corbin. And yep, what I'm going to be doing is reading and seeing what relevance I find that it has as I read it out. So from page 202, Apophatic Theology and the Antidote to Nihilism. Apophatic being the negative way, as in by talking about what God is not, which hasn't come up at all so far. Cheetham says, the hermeneutic ability of the creative imagination to transmute all things into symbols destroys the distinction between psychology and cosmology and unites them in a, quote, psychocosmology in which creator and creature participate, not as opposing terms with an ungulfable bridge separating them, but as complementary poles of a divine drama. So on the face of it, I can't talk about too much of what he means. He's sort of talking about employing imaginal practice in such a way that we can see things in an imaginal light. We can see things in a more, you could say, symbolic way, but that has connotations that we don't really like. As a way of using imagination creatively that can involve being far more deeply present to sort of the imagistic quality of things. Not quite the right way of putting it, but he was talking a great deal about meditating on the mandala in sort of in a Jungian way. So the idea is to cultivate imaginal practice in such a way that we start to see and experience life from out of what he calls the imaginal, and that we can recognize that as a kind of ground that things are defined from out of. And in a way, this is a reevaluation of Christianity. It's a process, I would say, that is supposedly capable of working with and uniting different pairs of opposites, would be the Jungian way of putting it. And one of these is the split that we see through Christianity of God and what God made, creator and creature. And so Corbin here is attempting to sort of reunite them in a specific process. That's Cheetham, sorry, who says, these poles, as in creator and creature, are conceived very differently by the dogmatic theologies. These restrict revelation to a single literal meaning that must be accepted equally by all. In this are the seeds of totalitarianism. So he's pointing to the importance of pluralism in a way. He's pointing to the importance of direct experience, direct personal experience of what revelation is, that necessarily remains open to interpretation in a way. You have to be really careful that I would talk about individual and collective processes. So one of the, again, working with different dialectics, that's one of them. And the importance being that each person is involved in this creative process of using imagination toward revelation enough that they're deeply personally impacted and touched, right? And there's a way of talking about that as theophany, the personal revelation of God, that in a sense is subjective. In a sense, it is relative, But it's not only that, especially when we can recognize and participate in the importance of group processes, collective processes. Indeed, it's again through the exoteric to the esoteric. So he's not talking about relativism here. He's talking about being deeply personally impacted by religious practice as an antidote to totalitarianism that is deeply involving of what he calls here creative imagination and symbolic understanding rather than literal understanding. Quote, and this is because if there is one law for all, then all are equal under that law. And as far as the law is concerned, their individual differences are of no account. This is just that same metaphysical leveling that makes objects out of the icons of creation. Persons become no more than units in a social machine. Yeah, so obviously this is quite tricky because we're wanting to defend democracy, presumably, at the same time as recognize individual differences. And I won't talk about that too much other than to say that there are tensions here again that are not being named. I think the difference might be in terms of a one law, because look, people like, for example, Tyson Yunkaporta, an Indigenous scholar at Deakin in the city where I live, Melbourne, talks about the law as in the law of the land. But there's something about that I wouldn't want to call it only emergent, but there's a way that human culture sort of naturally arrives at law as a result of deep embeddedness with place. But the distinction here is that there is a totalizing tendency that treats law in a top-down way. For example, sort of 10 commandments that are applied universally. And that comes with risks because it doesn't fit in perfectly in any particular location, if you see what I mean. There's a way that law considered in a bottom-up way, to put it like that, has a different quality. And so that means that we're trying to find a way of balancing the inevitability of hierarchy with the need for democracy, bottom up and top down mm, governance, and also the fact of individual differences and the need to cohere, all of which is obviously a discussion of all that would take us far afield of Cheetham and Corbin. So we'll steer back to what Cheetham is saying, which is wanting to bring back hierarchy and emphasize differences. And so the implication is, I think it would be unfair to identify all of that with that which makes objects. We need to find a way to preserve the parts of, Western culture, let's say since the Enlightenment, since the Renaissance, that we appreciate as a genuine innovation and an advance. It's not fair to equate all of that development with essentially person voiding nihilism. Quote, without the action and the passion of the principle of individuation, the uniqueness of each thing disappears and its divine connection is broken. Okay, so here again, there's a couple of things. I won't talk too much here, but I'll say that individuation properly involves movement toward wholeness and hence would include dimensions of passivity just as much as activity. For example, the capacity to receive, for example, material from the unconscious, the capacity to learn about oneself in a way that doesn't just involve action or doing, but being who one is. So I don't like reducing individuation to dimensions of action and passion. And properly understood, I think individuation would also have to apply within groups, I would say. Like it's any individual as such that can individuate, including groups as individuals. And so I think, again, that uniqueness is only sort of one half of a process. And while it is important, again, while Jung also emphasizes the development of who we are as ourselves, there's also the risks here of spiritual bypassing and the narcissism and spiritual marketplace that we see, where it's all very well for people to sort of be there in their uniqueness, but can we actually live together, right? Can we actually, do good in the world? It's not just that we have to be unique. There are also other considerations. Anyway, he said, without the action and the passion of the principle of individuation, the uniqueness of each thing disappears as its divine connection is broken. But we can steel man what he's saying and say that there is a re-emphasis on becoming and individuation that involves restoring the sense of our uniqueness and prioritizing that, certainly, in connection with the divine, which is very important. Quote, things fall apart. No thing can be oriented towards its celestial pole. No thing can be more or less itself, more or less real. And there remains only one level of being with one set of laws for all. Again, so the implication here is toward being in the imperative, to be. And what I would want to press on is yes, but how in practice, how do we get a sense, right, of how something can be more or less real? Because if we're wanting to, I guess, understand things in that way and be in the world in that way, it has to be practical. We have to be able to cultivate that capacity in practice. And this is nowhere in sight. Quote, religion becomes psychology, becomes biology, becomes chemistry, becomes physics, and there's nothing innate in the soul anymore. We are at the mercy of the all-powerful environment. Genes, parents, culture. Corbin puts this neatly, almost commenting tongue-in-cheek, quote, haven't we gone almost as far as to say that chromosomes are a fascist invention? Well, people have gone that far, actually. Yeah, I get what he means. I mean, there's this, it's quite reductive. It's, my point, it's quite ironic, actually. My point is that it's also ironic. It's reductive to put it this way, but also reductive in history, right? For this kind of development to take place. The idea is that we're deeply cut off from our uniqueness, cut off from our souls, and that the loss of traditional religion has definitely gone along with that. I think we can agree with that. But we can also see that, awareness of how deeply we're conditioned by, genes, parents, culture is profound, right? And being mindful of that allows us to, in a sense, take responsibility for creating the conditioning environments that we're in. Although I wouldn't necessarily take that as an endorsement of genetic engineering. Restoring access to the soul through religious practice, imaginal practice that is totally compatible with modern science is definitely a good idea. We see Viveki, for example, although he doesn't talk about the soul. I think it's also fair to say here that we see how this development did lead to postmodernism and then nihilism, and so it's fair to push back on these modern developments as they're doing. For Corbin, of course, the roots of all this lie in the loss of the imaginal world, with the entire cosmology, anthropology, and angelology that it entails, and metaphysics, and therefore a psychology not centered on imagination and the cognitive function of sympathy, must sooner or later degenerate into idolatry and literalism. In such a world, there can be no psychology of presence, and no means of effecting the intensifications of being required for true vision. Well, I won't say too much other than to say that to summarize, he's talking about restoring our access to in a way, the skill of the imagination, the function of the imagination, perceiving the world imaginally through the imaginal world, the cognitive function of sympathy, meaning it's a kind of deep connectedness from out of that modes of the soul, with beings, with forms. And I think it's reasonable to recognize that we need all of that. I think that at least that we're lacking a whole lot of that, right? And that can definitely go along with the psychology of sort of presence. It has sort of Heideggerian orientation toward dwelling more deeply in place, bringing presence into place. And that can definitely comport with kind of intensifications of being in the imperative to be, in a way, being more than we are. But again, the question is how, and there's no guidance about that being given. Quote, but Corbin distinguishes yet another thread in the complex web of metaphysical mistakes and existential decisions that have cut us off from the divine presence. Okay, so Corbin is just sort of doing more diagnosis here, and I think uh, Viveki is definitely drawn from this work, and I think it's not, for me, necessarily going to add anything deeply new, but let's find out. Corbin wants to keep diagnosing what's gone wrong. Quote, the mistake in question is one of confusing being with a being. A confusion between theotes, divinity, and theoi, gods. Yeah, so this is Heidegger's the problem of ontotheology. When we conflate being itself with a being, we end up in mistakes. So this is kind of, as well as getting ourselves out of the creator and creature distinction, they're going to want to get us out of the God as a being confusion. Quote, this mistake is itself rooted in the distinction made long made in the Abrahamic traditions between positive and negative theology. Okay, the question would be, how could those two be reconciled? That's a good question. The former, the positive way, via eminentia, I'd just call via positiva, or tashbih in Arabic, confers upon the divinity the characteristics of creatures, raised as it were to a higher power. God is the compassionate, the merciful, the forgiver, the loving, and so on. So they're positive qualities. God is this, and God is this, and God is this, and God is this. And there is something about the iterative quality of being about that. That's the positive way. Quote, in the Islamic tradition, these names of God stress his nearness and similarity to his creatures. So it's about immanence, essentially. Or this, I would tie nearness to immanence. We've just seen how attributes such as sympathy can lead all things back to God. But if not balanced by its opposite, this can amount to a kind of hyperinflation of the creatural world and makes of the absolute nothing more than a most perfect creature. The absolute divinity becomes a being, a highest being. This is the essence of just that idolatry that dogma tries so hard to avoid. This is totalitarianism, an absolutization of the finite attributes. So Jung would certainly agree with this. Jung would feel that sort of defining God in terms of qualities, like God is good or God is a being, that this is that these are finite attributes that come from as a result of human judgment, human evaluation, and that God is probably beyond those. And so there's a connection that's being made here between the positive way and the lack of the negative way. When we get stuck in only via positiva, God is this and God is this and God is this and God is this. This is a way of bringing God down into being like us as creatures. So it's a way of disconnecting from God as creator in a way. And so it's a way, again, in the Islamic tradition of stressing God's nearness and similarity to his creatures. And so the thing here is that, as he was pointing out in the sort of last chapter, last sections, noticing these the so in a way the imaginal essences. I shouldn't put it like that, but what he's saying is that we can all attributes through sympathy can lead back to God. So there's a way of saying God is this and God is this and God is this and God is this. When we can generate a sense for that, it's possible to practice such that through seeing everything in an imaginal way, we can be led to God. And so that's again, it's a process of sort of ascension, going up to God. But the trick there would be that if we forget that in practice, then we sort of get stuck in just attributing, like I was saying, God is this and God is this and God is this, and we don't recognize the sort of functional, in a way, value of seeing things that way, that it can function like a ladder to God. And so it becomes ossified into propositional tyranny and becomes assertion and dogmatic. We lose the skill, ending up confusing the map for the territory. Because we wouldn't be recognizing that talking in that via positiva way, right? God is this and God is this and God is this. That comes with affordances. It allows something. It's a way. It's a way, right? It's not exactly just a sort of dogmatic truth. It's actually a way to God. And so this is why he's saying that when this positive way is not balanced by its opposite, then God is reduced to, quote unquote, the creatural world, to a being. And so I would say not only should it be balanced by its opposite, which would involve obviously negative theology, which is what we're going to be talking about, but also practice. Right? The whole point is that we have to be able to treat each of these ways, the via positiva and via negativa, as just that, as a way to connect with that which we regard to be divine. It's not just about making sure we have a good balance between both kinds of dogma, let's say, both kinds of quote unquote truth, but that we can connect fundamentally through either and both ways. Anyway, so he identifies this, in a way, bias toward both dogma and literalism, so propositional truth rather than practice. He identifies that, and he identifies this reduction of God to a creature with totalitarianism, with idolatry, which, quote, threatens to erect an opaque and immovable God, fixed forever in its various perfections, placed there, what is more, by the acts of the creatures and reflecting them. Yeah, so there's a way that when we see God that way, when we regard him that way, he's sort of opaque in that. We're sort of emphasizing he is that. He is that. And it's like, yeah, but what more is he? Or is he, can we also recognize that he's not that? So there's a way of getting stuck in that perception, in that seeing, which he describes as sort of seeing God in this opaque way. It becomes immovable God. And not only does it have that effect, but it's also derived from us. It's quite placed there by the acts of the creatures and reflecting them. So in a way, what he's saying is that these are all projections. There's again issues with describing it that way, but the point is that it stems from our judgment, our regard. God is this. It's we who are saying that. And it's not exactly that that is wrong, but that it needs to be properly considered to be a way, not just assertion. And it also has to be balanced with that which is very much not coming from us, not coming from our judgment, but that which is beyond. It continues that this idolatry gives rise inevitably to nihilism. For the finite attributes themselves cannot in the end survive the inflation. Quote, they disappear into the abyss of the absolute infinite. Nietzsche saw this with shattering clarity and declared the death of God. Thus, idolatry and nihilism are inseparable. And this may be the central claim of the religions of Abraham. Okay, so there's a couple of little things there. What he's talking about is that sort of any quality that we define God as, God is this, God is that, God is that. In a way, it's smaller than what God is. And so there's a way that those attributes are finite. And being finite, that they won't last. So the absolute infinite, as it's called, is necessarily beyond and is kind of a kind of it's can be conceived to be like an abyss which swallows all such finite qualities, definitions. And when we don't recognize that and accept that, when we it's I mean it's quite natural in a way to understand that we can't really grapple with infinity. It's kind of the unknown set. When we can't do that, we resort to idolatry, trying to reduce or shrink God to something manageable, acceptable. And we can see how important that could be for people, right? Because otherwise we can't really get a grasp on God. But when it's taken in an absolute way, is his point. Not in a way which is just that, not in a way which is a way, but as a dogmatic kind of truth that simply reduces us without affording our, you could say, transcendence. Okay, so and then he's identifying idolatry and nihilism in this way. So it's a way of, in a way, clinging to those idols, clinging to those finite definitions. And because they're ultimately empty, because they ground in the abyss, we get attached to them. And those are idols, and they're hollow in some way. They're grounded in nothing. Hence nihilism. Again, kind of one of the key distinctions here is sort of between nothingness and no-thingness. And it's yeah, when our idols all get voided, right, by the truth of the depth of God, then we sort of land in nihilism. But if we can relate sort of consciously with the no-thingness of being, then in a way this is it can still be via negativa, but it's not exactly nihilistic anymore. It's more like emptiness. Cheetham says, the antidote to this nihilism of idolatry lies on the via negativa of negative or apophatic theology. So again, I would say this is the same sort of mistake, is that it's like replacing one kind of theology with another kind of theology. And Viveki's whole point is that, yes, but what if we could put it into practice? What can we really participate in both ways? Can we take each of these styles, let's say, as perspectives? All of that. Cheetham continues, in Islam, this is Tanzih, literally Tanzih. So yeah, sorry if I mispronounced that. Quote, declaring incomparability. No attributes can be predicated of the divinity. The absolute is nothing. The Quran says, there's nothing like him. But this is the nothing of being itself, the beyond being that yet is, as we have seen, that which gives being to each thing, the very principle of individuation. Okay, so it's a way of talking about being deified as that from out of which we are conferred with the quality of being a being. And that's quite interesting. There's this identity here between individuation and being, but I won't dwell on that. Cheetham continues, the unity of the divine, of the theotes, the unity of the divinity, the unity of, in a sense, of being, is what entails the unity and individuality of everything. Okay, so what this is saying is that, well, where do we get our own unity from? Where do we get our own individuality? And what this is saying is that our own unity, our own individuality is grounded in the unity and individuality of the divine. Again, it's a kind of correspondence, or you could say sympathy. It's a sympathy between the unity and individuality that is being or divinity, and the unity or individuality that we are. Cheetham continues. But also, this absolute of negative theology is the source and origin of all creation, the beyond beings from which they all descend, the nothing from which all things are derived, the supreme divinity, the Deus abscondita, the hidden God, I would say, can never be any kind of thing and is only encompassed by indirection in a negative theology. I wouldn't say encompassed, but anyway, it's the way to get to that supreme divinity in a way, the being which is beyond beings, is via negative theology. It is being, not a being. It is impossible to express this mystery of being, which brings each existent into being. That is, this mystery of the one, which brings each being into being as an existent. It's just saying the same thing. So now we get a quote from Corbin, which expresses this. Corbin says, we must at all costs avoid two symmetrical nihilisms. That of an affirmative theology, which is cataphatic, positive theology, erecting its absolute dogma, the idols, God is this, God is this, beyond which there would be nothing to search, or that of a negative theology, the apophatic, which would only aspire to the indetermination of the absolute, and which would lose from view that it is the hidden treasure on one side, and on the other side has a theology without theophany. So that's a little tricky. So what he's basically talking about is that each of these ways can be nihilistic. And I had a little difficulty with the second one. Yeah, so I've got it. So it's the distinction here that is, again, there are nihilisms both ways. And the first one is the positive kind of nihilism, which erects idols. And this is a kind of fundamentalist response, right? This is saying it's a reversion to those positive idols. And it results in nihilism because it doesn't have the imperative to search beyond those idols for what more God is. And in the other direction, there's the nihilism of negative theology. And the mistake is to equate the abyss with God, and moreover to regard that abyss as the abyss of nihilism. So this is Nietzsche's perception of the abyss in a way. So rather than to see the abyss as another name of God. So in a way, it's a literalistic version of the apophatic or negative way. So it literally takes the abyss to be God, and this is too literal. It's actually not. And so there's a way that either of these versions of nihilism, or you could say, well, firstly, why is the second one nihilism? And it's like because we sort of end up stuck in the abyss, and again, there's nowhere else to search because the abyss is equated with God or nihil. And so the idea would be to restore this symbolic view, the imaginal view, to both sides, so that it's truly a way, a positive way or a negative way. Cheetham says, the danger and the paradox lie in the fact that during the journey from unconsciousness through consciousness towards supra consciousness, quote, the soul is confronted by two darknesses. Okay, so he's trying to describe these risks in his own way, in their own way. And again, they seem to have a sort of metaphysics of ascension or going up ultimately in such a way that is sort of from unconsciousness and toward superconsciousness. And now we get a quote from Corbin that's designed to convey these two different kinds of nihilism that we've been discussing. Corbin says, there is only one darkness, which is only darkness. It can intercept light, conceal it, and hold it captive. When the light escapes from it, according to the Manichaean conception, or the Ishraq of Surawadi, this darkness is left to itself, falls back upon itself. It does not become light. But there is another darkness, called by our mystics the night of light, luminous blackness, the black light. So this part is a little tricky. So I have to try and combine sort of the two different kinds of nihilism that we were talking about with this kind of, in a way, it's a mythology that Corbin is sharing with us. And so again, we were talking about these two kinds of nihilism that were, in the first place, the positive kind of nihilism that results from the idolatry of God is this, God is this, God is this, when in fact we know that God is more. And the second kind of nihilism had to do again with apophatic theology and identifying God with the abyss. And when in reality, the we know that God is more than the abyss. So these are both conceived as idolatry and nihilism. And the second of those is identified as the nihilism of Nietzsche. And it's now conceived that each of these nihilisms are encountered on a way. And so there's a way of, it seems to me, that that through this story, the soul is on a journey. And when the soul is on a journey, it encounters two different kinds of darkness. and that correspond to the journey from unconsciousness through consciousness and toward essentially superconsciousness. And so, in the first place, the idea would be to get ourselves out of unconsciousness, and this is in some sense identified with the mythology of light and darkness. So there's a kind of when there's a mythology of this sort of eternal battle between light and darkness, and when the light, quote unquote, can withdraw the projections upon the idols and realize that God is more than that idol, and God is more than that idol. It's understood here that that light which is left, that darkness which is left behind, those idols, they do not become light. So here we have the idea that the first darkness which is confronted, the first kind of idolatrous nihilism, is associated with positive theology and also with unconsciousness and with the battle between light and darkness. And so the way of the soul is to, in a sense, withdraw the projections and recognize that each of these idols can be sort of a way to move on into a greater understanding of God. And so the soul moves into the state of consciousness and then toward superconsciousness. And here there's a second risk, a second encounter with darkness. And it's an encounter where there's an equivalent risk, which is the realization, it's a kind of realization that God is abyssal, that God is that which is beyond all conception, all quality. And it's to identify God with that. And that is a mistake. It's true, but again, God is more even than that, which is a little paradoxical. And so here, this is Nietzsche's mistake. So it's still idolatry, and it's still nihilistic, because it's a literal understanding. It is to confuse literally, to take literally that God is that abyss, which is false. It's not true. It's true, but it's only a partial truth. But it's identified with different qualities than what we were dealing with before. Instead of having the quality of cataphatic or positive theology, this is more a trap of the negative theology. And it's also associated with, rather than this metaphysical battle between light and darkness, it's an issue with the unity, the a light, quote unquote, which sort of combines darkness and light. And so this is encountered by the soul on the way from unconsciousness through consciousness towards superconsciousness. And this is conceived of as an approach toward the quote unquote celestial pole. And so now I'm going to give Corbin's quote, which describes a lot of what I was just talking about. And so these two darknesses that the soul confronts, quote, there is one darkness, which is only darkness. This is the first one. It can intercept light, conceal it, and hold it captive. When the light escapes from it, by withdrawing the projections, as we were saying, according to the Manichaean conception or the Ishraq of Surawadi, this darkness is left to itself. It falls back upon itself. It does not become light. So it's a bit of a dualistic vision. And he says, but there is another darkness called by our mystics the night of light, luminous blackness, black light. And so then Corbin is about to continue, but I want to say I think that there is a mistake here. And I think the mistake is to sort of only identify that from which we come as duality and that toward which we go as unity. I think properly that that from which we come can also be conceived of as a unity, and that toward which we go could also be conceived of as duality. And indeed, that either of them could be conceived in a quote unquote non-dual way, including qualities of both oneness and two-ness. And I don't like this association with our origins and this dualism between light and darkness, and that we're striving only toward unity. Because to me, it has a flavor of Gnosticism. So I would want to make sure that in practice, we could perceive both where we'd come from and where we were going in terms of both unity and duality, or indeed non-duality. Corbin finishes this quote by saying, orientation requires here a threefold arrangement of planes. The day of consciousness is on a plane intermediate between the luminous night of superconsciousness and the dark night of unconsciousness. The divine darkness, the cloud of unknowing, this is the second kind of darkness, the negative theology form, quote, the darkness at the approaches to the pole, the celestial pole, quote, the night of symbols through which the soul makes its way, is definitely not the darkness in which the particles of light are held captive. Yeah, so he's essentially just distinguishing them some more. That's fine. And then Cheetham says, and so the approach to the pole, meaning the celestial pole, that's sort of the way that we're going toward quote unquote spiritual ascension or something. So the approach to the pole is fraught with perils, only too well known in the West. For Nietzsche himself, quote, perished in the moment of triumph and fell victim to a failed initiation, quote, prey to extravagant thoughts and delirium. When the newborn higher spiritual ego begins to open and faces the station of the luminous darkness, then the danger is greatest. The Sufi would need an experienced shaykh to help him avoid the abyss and to lead him to the degree that is in truth the divine center of his being, and lead him to the degree that is in truth the divine center of his being. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. First of all, is that Nietzsche's illness is a complex phenomena that can't be reduced to a univariate cause. And so, although there are elements of what happened to Nietzsche that have to do with sort of falling into the abyss of nihilism, it's also true that he was devoured by Dionysus. And so, there's a way that Nietzsche was devoured by that abyss. He didn't just fall into endless air. So, there's a way that what I'm saying here is that the identification of the abyss with God comes about as a result of unintegrated shadow. And there is, if we want to disidentify the abyss and God, that would require not just the belief, not just the proposition, not simply the understanding that God is more than the abyss, but it will require a deep amount of psycho-emotional and psycho-spiritual work of both of both personal and transpersonal flavors. It would require dealing with the split between good and evil fundamentally. Because that's the thing is that, I made this argument years ago, but I'll make it again now, is that when you, when the death of God happens, it's not true that sort of the inverse is also dead. So again, in Christianity, we have this split between Christ and the Antichrist. And although it might be true to say that God is dead and that a lot of us don't really believe in, let's say, the story of Christ anymore, although I'm not committing myself to a position there, it's not a sure thing to say that you can simply disbelieve in the Antichrist. That's not exactly how it works, because those satanic qualities are associated with the deepest shadow that we have inside us, and it's not a matter of belief exactly. And the idea is that even if we, as let's say modern rationalists, claim to disbelieve in God, such that God is dead, we still project our shadow onto the abyss, onto namely the emptiness of Buddhism, hence resulting in the versions of Western Buddhism that have caused such trouble for us. And so again, the emphasis is that it's fine through Nishitani and others to make this distinction between nihilism as nothingness and emptiness or shunyata as no-thingness. But we haven't done the work. We haven't done the psycho-emotional and spiritual work to feel that properly, and to not only feel the new version properly, but to resolve ourselves from out of the trap of projecting uh, the shadow onto the abyss. And that is going to catch us unless we work on it, unless we recognize that and do something about it. It's not as simple as a matter of belief. Again, it has to be taken into practice, and not only intentional practice, but real deep work. And it's not an easy problem. I mean, it's a certain we've inherited this good and evil split for several thousands of years. We see how it's come through uh, Mazdaism, Zoroastrianism, into Christianity, and it seems to me that this Persian Sufism is uh, leaves that very conflict unresolved, because it's saying that that struggle of light against darkness, um, or Mazd and Ahriman, that is in fact, our origin. That's what we come out of. That's the unconsciousness that we're trying to sort of escape from. And that's exactly why I think it's a mistake, because it doesn't recognize the fact that original darkness that doesn't get turned into light, it's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. We have to know that. And it's exactly that, in a way, that darkness that Nietzsche fell into. I know you could say it's not exactly the same one, but I'm saying that in a way, this split, especially the one that has a moralistic flavor between good and evil, we're stuck with it for now, and we have to, like, really resolving that. It's going to require centuries of work, and it's all very well for us to orient toward, the God beyond the God of nihilism, and we may even be able to get a sense for that, but the the alternative can't simply be bypassed. The alternative can't simply be, it's not a philosophical position to move beyond. It's not that. I'll leave it at that. We also had here, if I may continue, yes, that Nietzsche was sort of led into that as a result of the inflation and couldn't deal with the self-deception and stuff. And John has talked about that, and this would be along the same lines, is that can we not only have wisdom schools that can help us deal with self-deception, and collective intelligence is a great asset. Um, can we have initiations that actually work? And can we, when we're talking about sort of ascension and sort of spiritual awakening and like that, when we're sort of reborn to higher aspects of our identity or whatever, can we also practice letting those go, stepping out of those identities just as much as stepping into them? But can that work on self-deception involve, I mean, stuff that John has talked about explicitly? For example, the practice of perspective taking, as I've been going on about, is explicitly designed to help us to avoid the traps of ego inflation, which is part of the whole point of talking about it. So that's why all this is coming in that context, the context of the general prescription. And otherwise, it would be the criticism that earlier they were talking about the importance of having a literally like a the imaginary friend, like the internal spiritual guide, and that was the best thing according to Corbin. But now it's like, oh well, to avoid these deep traps, we're going to need an experienced mentor sort of figure. And I'm like, well, I kind of pointed that out a long while ago, and that's why in a lot of these traditions there is a teacher and student tradition. So again, this is, I would say, resolving the risks that go along with sort of with Nietzsche requires community. It requires community and it requires intentional practice. It requires being mindful of all of these traps, being mindful of the abyss, and doing, yeah, intentional practice, right? Community-based work. It requires proper pedagogy, student and teacher stuff, mentoring. It also requires awareness of both different kinds of traps, both different kinds of idolatry and nihilism. And then it would also require specific work involving perspective taking to defend against ego inflation. And not only that, but as John has been saying, work involving the development of wisdom, which is including but not limited to, perspective taking, brought down into intentional practice. And again, both of these being treated as a way, the restoration of the symbolic and symbolic participation. And yeah, to me, again, I think the main point that I'm not seeing in John, I mean, he's called for it, but community, 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 community. It's the best and oldest solution to self-deception. Cheetham continues, but Nietzsche's cry of anguish is precisely what, for a Sufi, is experienced as the supreme test, the test of the veil, as a divine withdrawal. Okay, so we're trying to understand, Nietzsche's fall into the abyss as a kind of test in Sufism, a supreme test. I'm reminded of St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul. And we get a short quote from Corbin to describe this. Corbin says, here we can see how imaginatively and spiritually disarmed we are in comparison with those spirituals, those sort of spiritual masters, whose certainties we have evoked. What we experience as an obsession with nothingness, or as acquiescence in a non-being over which we have no power. This was to them a manifestation of divine anger, the anger of the mystic beloved. But even that was a real presence, the presence of that image that never forsook our Sufis. Okay, that's extremely interesting. So, what Corbin is drawing here is a distinction between our modern relationship with the abyss and the relationship of the abyss as experienced by Sufi masters. And so, if I try to draw out the distinction, he uh, describes how we tend to experience this the abyss of nihilism, this nothingness, as an obsession. We kind of get obsessed with it. There's a way that it's sticky. There's a way that it doesn't just go away. There's a way that we can't look away from it. I would connect that it's like an irremovable object. It's hard to shift. It doesn't just disappear, it's there and it's there and it's there. And it also, I would say, has a numinous quality, right? In the sense of mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans. It's fascinating, right? We can't look away from it. And so this is the qualities of obsession, I would say. Again, what we experience as an obsession with nothingness. But as well as that, we also experience as a kind of acquiescence. So it's a kind of relinquishing or letting go. It's a recognition of powerlessness in a non-being. So there's a way of a feeling that we have that non-being is powerful, that we can't do anything to escape non-being in a sense. Quote, over which we have no power. And so we can see here that we look, this is really, really deep existential feelings that we feel, right? And these are not to be sort of skipped over willy-nilly. They need to be like really, really diagnosed properly, and there need to be proper protocol in place for dealing with them as cultural, as collective phenomena, just as much as individual phenomena. And simply stating that that's not actually what the abyss is doesn't help us in the least to realize that because we haven't dealt with these deep existential feelings. I would also say, as well as this obsession with nothingness and this acquiescence to non-being over which we have no power, we also saw how last time, in the episode on Corbin's theosophy of nature, we were talking also about powerlessness. And so here we've been talking about powerlessness over non-being. And there we were talking about, quote, the inability to experience sympathy with nature. And the idea that one of the places from which this inability can stem is a, quote, fear of the infinite vastness of reality and the powerlessness of the ego to dominate and control it. And that's in a way the same powerlessness. And I talked about how um, so here the term reality and the nothingness of non-being are equated. And so importantly, that powerlessness, there's something true about that, right? It's in a way, it's fair enough for the ego to feel powerless over non-being. Um, and we could practice learning to be with that as as not an illusion, but as something genuine that we feel. We could also practice uh, transmuting that powerlessness into empowerment, such as recognizing that power which we do have. And I would say that there's not anything inherently wrong with that recognition. And indeed, I would say that it's a good thing. That there could be a balance, again, cultivated between the sense of powerlessness as humbling rather than humiliating, and the sense of powerfulness as empowering rather than prideful or arrogant. And that these can be experienced in dialectic, can be managed in dialectic, in relation to both being and non-being. So it's not just like, for example, one of the powers that we have over non-being is that we are, that we have being. Anyway, I'll leave that discussion there. We can then say that I would say that managing that dialectic of powerfulness and powerlessness, um, in relation to being and non-being, and seeing through that which is illusory about them and seeing that which is truthful about them and balancing them with other truths. That's all really important therapeutic work. And I would say that that therapeutic work is necessary if we are to um, resolve our obsession with nothingness, and this and our sort of fawning acquiescence to non-being that I would call. So what I would talk about is cultivating the capacity to take up the perspectives of, I would say, ego, shadow, soul, divine double, and the Jungian self. Or, I mean, you could just talk about it in terms of parts work, really. And then I would sort of work with the dialectics of, yeah, powerfulness and powerlessness in relation to being and non-being in a way that emphasizes the truth of what we feel rather than cutting through what we feel as illusory. Okay. So then what I want to do is compare what we've just been talking about, which are I would call unintegrated, our unintegrated projected shadow upon non-being that we see in Nietzsche too, and dealing with that, where it shows up again as the powerlessness of the ego over reality, our obsession with nothingness, Nietzsche's mistake of falling into the abyss, identifying that with God, and our acquiescence to non-being. And so, but to these Sufis, they experience that abyss in a different way, and I'm going to try and describe what that way is. Corbin said, to them, a manifestation of divine anger, the anger of the mystic beloved. Okay, so I can't exactly speak from their point of view, right? But so it's quite interesting to talk about the quality of abyss, the quality of non-being as an expression of anger. The implication is sort of the abyss is typically something feminine, or there's no reason why anger can't be feminine. The anger of the mystic beloved, capitalized. So I think what I would understand is, so I would connect the divine anger with the sort of the Old Testament God, right? Yahweh, in the book of Job kind of thing. And so dealing with that requiring, in a sense, submission, devotion to God. And well, I do think that that's something that's sort of worth cultivating. It may also not be fair to equate divine anger with that. And then I would say a couple of other notes is that I was talking about I was talking about that nothingness, the abyss that we're in relation to, and our obsession with that as a kind of unresolved shadow projection. And properly, repression means repressed into the unconscious, meaning we're unconscious of that which we project upon the abyss. And I would follow Jung and certainly my own understanding. I mean, I found out that Jung also believed that, but it's like, wow, that unconsciousness is our deepest shame, that we're most ashamed of being unconscious. And I would also understand that anger often conceals shame, perhaps particularly in men, although not exclusively. And so to me, the stuff about the sort of the Old Testament God and the anger that seems to go along with it, whether that manifests in the form of the abyss or not, to me, all of that is going along with the dynamics of shame and the dynamics of unconsciousness. What do I mean by that? I think the process of becoming conscious, as he was talking about that way, involves withdrawing the projection of a great deal of both sh anger and underlying shame. And we would be withdrawing them from projection upon God or projection upon the abyss as an instance of God, let's say. So this would be a way of understanding, I think, if I follow it through, and I wouldn't want to reduce it to this, but if I follow it through, it would be a way of understanding that the sort of over the omnipotence is in a sense I'm giving a sort of Jungian reading on that. I'm saying that the overpowering Old Testament God is a sort of source of these deep emotions, the deep power that we deny about ourselves. So the anger that we deny, the shame that we deny, and the power, in fact, that we deny. I'll leave that discussion there. I think it would be fair to say, in general, that our experience of God has been deeply wrapped up with a whole lot of emotion that we've been, and not only emotion, that we've been unconscious of, and that people for a very long time have experienced that which is utterly beyond, as in a sense coming through that which they repress about themselves. And Jung, for example, in that little episode at the end of the psychological type series on the myth of Pandora, Jung talks explicitly about how the God image sort of brings the unconscious with it and often gets confused with it. The idea being that it's quite possibly our anger and our shame and our powerfulness and powerlessness, and God would be, I think, quite properly beyond all of those. Where the traps here would involve identifying. Yeah, and it's the thing is, it's not just literalism, it's not just dogma, it's deep emotion, it's deep confusion in the unconscious, you could call. it's not quite as simple as symbolic work. It's also deep emotional work, among other kinds of work. Because if we follow through the argument, then it would be quite proper to regard that God is not the anger of God, and God is not non-being, God is not being, God is not acquiescence or obsession or shame or anything or nothing. The Corbin simply finishes his quote by saying that even though these Sufi mystics were in relationship with this God as a sort of manifestation of divine anger in the form of the abyss, that they took that even that they took that to be a real presence, quote unquote. And so it too was a sort of icon of God that they regarded as never forsaking them. In a way, quite a Jobian attitude to sort of put up with it in a faithful way. Okay, so Cheetham continues, and I'll keep going here. And yet, that very witnessing of the unique that is ever present, ever withdrawn, that is love, lover, and beloved, unified through compassion and longing, that draw all things onward toward union and unity, is in each case unique, wholly present to each according to his capacity. Corbin cites again and again the hadith central to the spirituality of Sufism. Quote, he who knows himself knows his Lord. Okay, so he's just emphasizing the quality of uniqueness, the unique progression of individuation, in a sense. That it's like even though we're in relationship with sort of God himself, there's still something unique about that. Obviously deeply comporting with Jung and Socrates to know thyself. He says, it is this knowledge that is the foundation for and the true esoteric meaning of monotheism. Beyond all idolatry, beyond even, quote, the black light. Okay, so that's quite interesting. The idea that monotheism has an esoteric meaning and that it's connected with uniqueness and knowledge of thyself. Corbin says, through the redemptive path of pure love, the consciousness of love's faithful becomes that of the mystic who knows that he is the eye with which God contemplates himself. That he himself in his being is the witness by which God witnesses himself, the revelation by which the hidden treasure reveals itself to itself. Okay, so I can understand that sort of in the terms of Eckhart, the eye with which I know God is the same eye with which he knows me. And I can understand that for sure. There is one God, right? And this is a kind of esoteric meaning of monotheism. I think we also still see that monotheism tends toward the fundamentalist kind of idolatry. And that isn't sort of noticed here. So I'm kind of like, okay, well, if there's a connection between the esoteric meaning of monotheism and the uniqueness, the personal connection, for example, Jacob Boehm and Eckhart, well, then why does monotheism tend toward the unification in a collectivizing way? There's actually different paths towards unification where sort of collectivization toward totalizing monotheism is quite different from individuation. So I might submit sort of sociological reasons. I mean, among other reasons, why monotheism tends toward the exoteric, sorry. And it's quite helpful for him to point out that there is esoteric versions of monotheism, and that it's possible to have access to them, even if the thing is that it's like so rare. Like how many mystics of the caliber of Meister Eckhart and Jacob Boehm are there? And I guess this is, so to me, this is why the esoteric meaning of monotheism in individuation is sort of far more accessible. But then we can also see here how to say it exactly. It's like, yeah, well, as is the whole point is that we've lost imaginal practice, we've lost the imaginal, we've lost the ecology of practices. And so even if we have the monotheism that could be toward esotericism, in practice it doesn't work that way. It hasn't for a long time, not least because of sociological reasons. Anyway, when we experience this sort of mystical vision of the eye by which I see God as the same eye by which he sees me, Cheetham says, this then is the angel of the face, the only God that we can ever know. Not the Deus abscondita beyond all being, but the God who knows himself in and through us. So that is quite helpful in the sense of reorientation toward immanence, in a way, the God that we are, rather than the God that is utterly beyond. But again, I would want to draw it down into practice, and can we experience both? Corbin says, Israel was able to serve only its God and could proclaim the unity of only its God. Each of us as well has recognized his God, the one to which he's able to respond. The angel of the face, sorry, the angel is the face that our God takes for us. The angel is the face that our God takes for us. And each of us finds his God only when he recognizes that face. Okay, well, so that's quite helpful for me because it's a way to understand the divine double as, in a way, an emanation, right? It's a face of God, the face that God takes for us. That's what the divine double is, what Corbin means by the angel. The idea being that we could, yeah, in theory, sort of integrate and transcend that identity. Yeah, there would be a tension there, sort of, that again could be resolved through intentional practice of sort of experiencing that divine double, the angel as the face of God, in sort of positive form, in numinous form, and the temptation to identify with that, the solution to which would be obviously disidentification and the orientation toward God in the beyond. So if we can practice the perspective taking that helps us to take up those perspectives, then we do run the risk of the ego inflation, and not the inflation of the ego, but in a way being subsumed by the idol of the positive vision. And so cultivating not, again, I've said it again, not only the capacity for perspective taking, but the capacity for letting go of perspectives, participating in and through them, and growing in such a way, as Jung said, individuation is the outgrowing of different conflicts, outgrowing them. That's so helpful. Cheetham says, Corbin calls the necessity for the pluralization of the unique divinity into an unlimited number of theophanic forms the paradox of monotheism. Even at the furthest extremes of mystical experience, we are as nothing when compared with the absolute, and our vision of the divinity is necessarily partial. Quote, each being, says Ibn Arabi, has as his God only his particular Lord. He cannot possibly have the whole. Here we have a kind of theism, which is from the Greek meaning one by one. In Vedic polytheism, this expresses the idea that each god is, for a time, considered as single and supreme. That's quite helpful. One by one. That's just like taking on different parts and then taking them off again. It's perspective taking. It's the iterative form of being again. So this kind of, yeah, this one by one quote, this kind of theism, which is verified in the context of a mystic experience, where the divine being is not fragmented, but wholly present in each instance, individualized in each theophany. That's so fascinating. So it's a way that obviously there are sort of traps on either side, right? If we're fragmented into the multiplicity, then that's painful. It's like being shattered. But if we're totalized into the unity, then that's extremely lonely, existentially lonely. And on the other hand, we have the experience of being unified and whole as the one, and at the same time, the experience of being in relation with oneself, being in relation with the other, so to speak. And we would want to account for both of the existential versions, what I mean is the negative versions of both of those. But by which I mean, the experience of being fragmented and the experience of being lonely. Can we be with those feelings, existentially speaking? And then can we create this positive feedback loop between an opponent processing reciprocal opening dynamic between? Yeah, iterative being, one by one, perspective taking and perspective leaving, being in the many, while at the same time being one. And there's a particular relationship there that we haven't yet worked out how to do. Dangers in both polytheism and monotheism. Cheetham says, it is this ungraspable unity of the one God. Ungraspable unity. That's quite helpful. So there's a humility in recognizing that a man's reach should always exceed his grasp. There's a humility that shouldn't be turned into a humiliation. Again, we want to balance humility with pride, I would say. Or you could say confidence, or it doesn't quite capture it again. Quote, it is this ungraspable unity of the one God that provides the possibility for the unification, the individuation of each of the infinite plurality of things. So that's extremely helpful. So the idea would be that if we could understand the imperative to be and toward unification, right, then the humility of recognizing that we don't have all of the one God there are affordances that go along with that, such as the possibility to unify further. So that means that the imperative to be, going along with the humility of recognizing the ungraspable unity, is always a yes and. So this God and more and more and more like that. Without stopping on any particular rung. I've got it all. Again, it is this ungraspable unity of the one God that provides the possibility for the unification, the individuation of each of the infinite plurality of things. So again, where humility is understood, this existential humility of recognizing that we don't have a grasp on the whole, or that we do, but it's a very tiny grasp on the whole, allows for each of the beings to be individuated in its plurality, but it also allows the whole to, in a sense, progress toward unity. Both. Quote, it is the principle of individuation itself. I would really connect this again with being in the imperative. Cheetham continues, exoteric monotheism immobilizes God and the cosmos in a static and deadly structure when it confuses God as being, the principle of individuation, with God as a supreme being. It is the death of being to confuse the unity of being, esse, with a pseudo-unity of beings, ens, which is essentially multiple. So that's quite interesting. So earlier, again, in the previous discussion, we were talking about immobilization in the context of containment. So when we sort of feel that powerlessness, again, powerlessness in the face of the, I would say, anger and shame associated and shadow associated with the abyss, that we feel powerless before reality, right? And moreover, that our reaction to that, as I was talking about, the reaction to that is Nietzsche's will to power. So again, it's we've come from, we have a fear of this infinite vastness of reality, or for example, of its anger or the shame that we feel, for example, and the powerlessness of the ego to dominate and control that reality. And so I talked about how the powerlessness was kind of at the root, and that it was both sort of truthful or accurate and also illusory or out of balance with powerfulness and connecting with that. And then it sort of results in this fear and results in the need to dominate and control reality, leading to the destruction of nature and so on. And when it does that, quote, as Corbin said, the cause may be a will to power, dogmatic or otherwise, which wishes to immobilize beings and forms at the point where man has immobilized himself, perhaps out of a secret fear of the infinite successions of perpetual transcendences, and the knowledge that to be faithful to the angel is precisely to let ourselves be guided by him towards the transcendences that he announces. So we can see how this is a deep fear of self-transcendence, right? And that the idea that we might indeed be not only denying who we are, but deeply afraid. And I connected this, so the wish to immobilize beings and forms, with predator-prey circuitry that I described as connected with game theory. I've got to get you before you get me. I've got to get you before you get me. And so we see the same thing back here. Again, exoteric monotheism immobilizes God. So there's a way that exoteric monotheism is, I would say, trying to eat God and the cosmos, trapping them in a static and deadly structure when it confuses God as being with God as the supreme being. Yeah, so it's like throwing a net over God and it's not working. Because it's not God that's immobilized, it's oneself that's immobilized. And I would say that, yeah, I would say that that net, the net is the net as in the net of time and space, you know, and it's a feminine symbol. It's the net of time, space, and place, and fate, and the net of destiny, the net of the cosmos. It's the conditions of our being that are it's the Cartesian frame, you know, the graph, and it's a feminine. Why is it feminine? Well, that's a little tricky. It's both. I have to step back a little and be more careful. So it's both sort of order and precision and like that, which is masculine, right? As the logos, for example, organization. But it's also feminine in the sense that it's the absolute one which is beyond, and then the net of our human conditions is sort of derivative from that. So I was connected. If it's fear of the absolute or infinite, well, it's hard to tell. Maybe masculine and feminine is the wrong kind of dynamic to use to assess it. But basically, the tendency toward that quote unquote exoteric monotheism, which immobilizes God, I would connect that again with unintegrated shadow. I think the deepest form of that is this tendency toward, yeah, the bias toward the sense of powerlessness rather than powerfulness, and the fear and the need to control and dominate. And there's a way that that's masculine in the sense that it's men that tend to be predatory, but I think that's a little reductive. So I wouldn't want to say that it's only coming from unintegrated masculine shadow. It's more like unintegrated shadow. Anyway, so that's quite helpful. Yeah, I've got to get you before you get me, where the you is God. I've got to immobilize God by turning it into by trapping it in the cosmos, by trapping it in this static and deadly structure, denying transcendence, denying self-transcendence, denying individuation, denying being itself. Cheetham continues, this absolute, of which nothing can be predicated, can never be an idol. It is the hidden treasure that became known in and through creation. And the supreme form of its manifestation in being is in the mode of presence of the absolute person. And the supreme form of its manifestation in being is in the mode of presence of the absolute person, each time unique. The God, the angel, whose divine birth is the signal of the birth of the soul in each seeker. Again, the supreme form of its manifestation is being. Oh God, let me try it again. The whole paragraph is quite difficult. Cheetham says, this absolute, meaning being or reality, of which nothing can be predicated, can never be an idol. It is the hidden treasure that became known in and through creation. And the supreme form of its manifestation in being is in the motive presence of the absolute person, each time unique, the God, the angel, whose divine birth is the signal of the birth of the soul in each seeker. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I would have to say there. It may be the case that sort of the supreme form is sort of the mode of presence, which is that of the angel, which I would sort of connect. There's a couple of things there. One of them is that the awakening of this being is the sort of amnesis of the being, which is the combination of the human soul and sort of celestial soul or soul and divine double. And they can sort of come out of fragmentation and into unity, which is the amnesis of the sort of absolute person that we are. And this here is regarded as a mode of presence, which is also the supreme form of the manifestation of the deity. And I would say, I would talk about that as a perspective to take up. But then the problem is that we don't want to get addicted to the supreme form, right? Which would be ultimately a kind of inflation, because ultimately that supreme form is also not the whole deity. So I hope I'm not making a mistake there. I don't think so. It's kind of like, yeah, the final form in Pokemon, but such profanity anyway. Yeah, so again, it's like what he's talking about is cultivating the capacity to take up the perspective of the quote unquote absolute person, which is conceived here by me as a sort of, from previous understanding of this book, is as the amnesis of the sort of non-fragmented soul and divine double. And I'm like, yes, it's great to take up that perspective, but what about letting that perspective go again? Maybe I'm just being too critical, but I think it's important to note in passing. Cheetham says, no, sorry, Corbin says, and we're almost at the end. He says, the angel, meaning divine double. Sorry, it's not just like, I understand it properly to be the integration of all the layers of the identity. So the ego and the soul and the divine double and so on. So he's sort of emphasizing the perspective of the divine double, but I would understand it definitely that the absolute person is, again, a combination of soul and divine double. He just says the angel, quote, the angel is the face that our God takes for us. And each of us finds his God only when he recognizes that face. The absolutely indeterminate only becomes the revealed God, Deus revelatus, by relation to the creature, insofar as this Deus revelatus is the creator of it. It's necessary, therefore, that the absolute come out of its absolutity, deposit a creature of which it is personally the God. Again, the absolutely indeterminate only becomes the revealed God, the Deus revelatus, by relation to the creature, insofar as this revealed God is the creator of it. It's necessary, therefore, that the absolute come out of its absolutity, to posit a creature, the angel, of which it is personally the God. Sorry, the creature, sort of, there's a way that God emanates into the angel, but then there's also a way that we are an emanation of that angel too. It's tricky. So there's a way that the angel is the creature from the point of view of God, the creator, but there's also a way that the angel is the creator from the point of view of us, the creature. Cheetham continues. In order to prevent God and creation, both from closing off, solidifying into idols, in order to keep the sympathy alive, and ensure the perpetual angelic function of beings, quote, Tashbih must be balanced by Tanzi. Sorry for that, but he says that nearness and distance both are essential attributes of God. Together they make up Tawhid, the declaration of unity. Nearness and distance, so I would call immanence and transcendence in a way. And so we encountered these two terms earlier as the sort of positive way and the negative way, or the cataphatic and apophatic ways this is in Persian Sufism. So where the first one, Tashbih in Arabic, confers upon the divinity the characteristics of creatures. God is the compassionate, the merciful, the forgiver, the loving. Whereas the opposite, which is sort of Tanzi, is sort of declaring incomparability. No attributes can be predicated of the divinity. The absolute is nothing. And so each of these balances each other. And so they're called nearness and distance as essential attributes of God. And together they make up, quote, Tawhid, the declaration of unity. Which again, each direction, I would say, has to be brought down into intentional practice. Quote, we can now understand the full import of the hidden things and just what it is of God that lies within. Quote, Tanzi corresponds to Batin and Tashbih corresponds to Zahir. Okay, so I would have to clarify that for a second. I found it. So he talks about sort of the apparent and exoteric as Zahir, and versus the occulted and esoteric or batin. And so this is connected with sort of the visible and the hidden, and the sort of the apparent, the obvious, the literal, and the esoteric. sorry, going along with the apparent, the visible, the obvious, go along with the exoteric versus the hidden, the not obvious, the concealed, going along with the esoteric. And so what he was connecting was that yeah, it's sort of obvious connection that the negative way, the negative theology toward God is not that, God is not that, God is not that, otherwise known as Tanzi. It corresponds to Batin or the esoteric, the hidden. And yeah, so and then the other way around as well, that the positive way sort of corresponds to the exoteric or the apparent. And yeah, so the way that he says that is the outward and the manifest is the nearness of God or immanence, whereas the inward and the hidden is the oneness, the incomparability, the no-thingness of the divinity. And so what I would say is I wouldn't want to conflate those two. So I want to try and ask the other way around, right? In which ways, yeah, so the outward, as in the via positiva, one way to do it might be to, I don't quite know how to get at it. How can I get at that? I think one thing I would say is that it's not exactly by mapping collective and individual, although I can also do that. It's that um, certain things only become visible when when we approach the esoteric, right? When we're at we could call a lower level, but it's risky to put it that way. That there's a lot which is not possible, not visible, not apparent, and so it's not always, yeah. And so there's a way that there's still a risk of orienting too much toward the inward and the hidden. And so I would also put that this maps well with individual and collective. So again, there's certain kinds, I would say, of inwardness and hiddenness, and certain kinds of outwardness and manifestation that are only possible through group practice, but then vice versa with individual practice, all of which I would want to see explored, practically speaking. Anyway, I'll move on because it's almost at the end. Cheetham says, the manifest tends to descend into idolatry. The hidden opens onto the infinite. See, to me, it's also that runs at the risk not only of Nietzsche's kind of nihilism, but the hidden also has a different kind of idolatry, which is the idolatry of one's own spiritual identity, and non-participation via spiritual bypassing. So I would call that a different kind of idolatry, which is more connected with the esoteric and the hidden. Again, not emphasized here. Cheetham says, God's nearness is external. It is his distance that lies within. Yeah, look, it can also be the other way because imagine that there is sort of revelations of God that are only possible through, in a way, the without. That, for example, participation in and among the group, right? Then his distance would lie without, and vice versa. There are nearnesses of God that can only be found within. But I don't want to just be confusing here. So he said that God's nearness is external and his distance lies within. Quote, it is through the no-thingness of the divinity, the no-thingness of the divinity, that the essential infinitude of a person, of a presence, is determined. Again, between finitude and transcendence. And so, quote, by turning, yeah, so I would just, I really don't think so. I really think that a person's infinitude can only be realized through the exoteric, but which is because that's what they were talking about. I really think that it is via participation, via going in and among the group, down and among, that infinitude is realizable. So I think both ways of talking about it are valuable. I think there's a way that when we're on our own, we're very finite. You know what I mean? So it's through the other that infinitude opens in some ways. Anyway, he says, and so by turning the world inside out, by giving birth in the world to that interiority that is characteristic of the things of the soul, by giving birth in the world, by winning each skirmish in the battle for the anima mundi, soul of the world, we return the hidden dimension to the manifest and uncover the depths that lie just under the surface of the world. Corbin sees in Jacob Boehme the principal Western exponent of the apophatic path, taken also preeminently by the Shiites. Yeah, so again, so the same criticism that I've sort of been making all the way along is that properly understood, the path that integrates esoteric and exoteric, uh, inner and outer, nearness and distance, uh, apophatic and cataphatic, and so on, is inherently superior to or allows one to get, I don't know, closer to the divinity. I don't, what do you want to, how do you want to put it? It's better. It's preferable than the apophatic path, a path that is exclusively apophatic. So I would talk about this in terms of Corbin's biases, because again, it was understood previously in the text that even if one wants to realize the most mystical and inward and interior of visions, that it is via the exoteric that is done. And I talked about the dogma of individuals, the dogma of gnosis in that context. But anyway, Corbin quotes Alexander Koyré. Quote, what Bohm believes in advance of all doctrine, what he searches for, what all his doctrine is destined to justify, is that God is a personal being, capital B. More than this, that he is one person, a living person, self-conscious, an active person, a perfect person. Quote, note well, Corbin comments, the words that he searches for. The personal God is not given primitively. He is encountered at the end of a quest, as of that for the Holy Grail. The end point of this search is not an idol, not a thing at all, and therefore not an end but a beginning. The openness of the personal God means that persons, even finite limited ones, through their likeness to the divinity, are not things at all. Again, the openness of the personal God means that persons, even finite limited ones, through their likeness to the divinity, are not things at all. Martin Buber, I and thou. And the God that the mystic seeks is a real person, infinite, living, symbolic. All of this is guaranteed by the nothingness. Sorry, all this is guaranteed by the nothing from which all things arise. And nihil, or shunyata, whose primary attribute is not the abyss, but unending determinations of the plenitude of beings. It's the emptiness, the unknown, and unknowable into which one falls upward in an unending series of theophanies. Yeah, I mean, I hate to spoil it, but to me, it does still have a flavor of the quality of being unlimited in a way that is not necessarily desirable. Falling is still falling, no matter which direction you're falling. But I get the point. So we might leave it there. I don't really have anything to add at the end. It was already a lot, right? So I'll leave this as a discussion of apophatic and cataphatic, and also, integrating nihilism, integrating the God and the beyond. I don't know, it's hard to talk about, right? But the esoteric and exoteric, visible and invisible, there's a lot here. Being as individuation and the problem of ontotheology in Heidegger. Okay.